The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to FTA's members webinar, Are You in Compliance? Understanding the EU Timber Regulation. My name is Heather Kiggins. I'm the events coordinator at the Foreign Trade Association and I will be moderating this 1-hour webinar. Let me first introduce you to some webinar logistics. So everybody is on mute and you will remain unmuted for the duration of the webinar. You can ask questions in the chat box located on the right-hand side of your screen. All questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar. Please indicate who you are addressing your questions to, and we will do our best to make our way through the questions, and any questions that can't be answered in the duration of the webinar, we will send to you in a follow-up email. So if you cannot hear, please do use the chat box also to let us know. So I will first introduce you to the agenda of this webinar. So Stephanie Raymond is FTA Senior Environmental Coordinator. She will present you with the FTA's Timber Industry Risk Assessment, which was released just yesterday. It's an exclusive for participants here today. We will then move on to Wheat Rates. He works for the Belgian Ministry for Health, Food Chain Safety and Environment. This is the competent authority to enforce timber regulation. Then Olivier Coulpet, he is the Forest Legality Specialist at NEPCON, a monitoring organization based in Denmark, but he is based in the UK at the moment. And then we will move back to Stephanie Raymond, who will introduce the BPI Timber Pilot. And then we will address all your questions at the end of the webinar. So let me first hand over to Stephanie. Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Heather. So I'll just give you a quick introduction to why we've decided to look at timber here at the FTA, and also to explain a little bit about the industry risk assessment, which, as Heather mentioned, was just published yesterday. So why timber? Well, first of all, we've had a look at the membership of FTA, and we realized that over 300 companies and associated 1,300 producers fall within the scope to be possibly in EU timber products due diligence requirements. As you are probably aware, the EU timber regulation has entered into force in March 2013, so it's already legally binding in all member states with quite some repercussions for non-compliance. So it's a serious issue which we think we want to raise to our members and to also support you in your compliance. And of course, the timber regulation has a strong focus on supply chain due diligence and assessing and mitigating risks. And the FTA has services that can support members in their due diligence. This will be explained later when we talk about the BPI timber pilot. So we just wanted to not only raise awareness of the issues, but also how FTA can support members going forward. So first of all, just to give you some highlights on the FTA industry risk assessment on timber. So these risk assessments are published regularly by the FTA, and it really gives an overview of key trade and sustainability risks per sector. The assessments are based on FTA's own insights, also data from our membership, specifically BSCI 2.0 audit results, and as well industry sources of expertise. expertise. It includes recommended actions for members and their producers, and also an analysis of future trends and the possible impact. You might have seen previous reports. There have been reports also in textile industry, toys, kitchenware, electronics, and footwear. So this one is specifically focused on timber. Next slide. Okay, so as we mentioned, around 15% of our FTA members are in the wood products industry. This includes furniture, stationery, textile and printed materials, household decorations and ornaments, arts and crafts, and lawn and garden supplies. This is just a picture to show you a bit how the risk assessment looks like. Today I will just share with you some very brief highlights, and then I'll also show you how you can access the reports to read the full analysis. Okay, so the report is split into trade, social, and environmental assessment. So looking at trade, first of all, what we've seen is China is one of the major suppliers of timber products to the EU, up to 21% of wood products and close to 20% as well of pulp, paper, and according to a study by the European Commission, more than 17% of China's wood-based imports are at high risk of being illegal. And in the graphs underneath, you can see some of the main countries that are importing the wood products into China, just for your information. So according to countries, actually. So from a trade perspective, looking at where the timber is coming from can really have an impact on the risks associated with it, which we will go into more detail later in the webinar, and also you can find more information in the risk assessment. From a from an environmental point of view, first of all, we did look at the BSCI 2.0 audit results, which were carried out between 2015 and 2017. 462 timber producers from across 24 countries were audited. The vast majority took place in China, followed by Vietnam. And of course, the BSCI 2.0 audit results it's quite limited from an environmental perspective, but we can get some insights into the main risks. And what was found was a lack of due diligence in handling hazardous chemicals, and that practices are going ahead without the full set of official permits. So from an environmental point of view, those were the two main risks highlighted according to the audits. Of course, the BSCI audit does not cover sustainable sourcing policies, so compliance with the EUTR wouldn't be taken into account there. And from a social point of view, the main two risks that were found, according to the risk assessment, was that there's a high percentage of factories with low worker protection, and as well a high risk of health and safety risks. So those were the two main findings from a social point of view. So as I mentioned, this was just to give you a quick insight on some of the main sections we covered in the risk assessment, but we would encourage you all to take a look at the full report. This is how you can find it, actually. So on the FTA website, you need to log in, as the industry risk assessments are specifically for members. So log in at the FTA website, click on resources, and if you do a search for industry risk assessment, then you will find not only the timber risk assessment, but also the other industries that have been done in the past.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Very much, Stephanie. We will now move on to the EU timber regulation, where wheat rights will introduce an update on the EU timber regulation.
We don't hear you. I don't know if you're speaking. We see that you're on mute, but we don't hear you at the moment. Okay, we seem to be having a technical difficulty with Wheat's presentation. We don't hear him, so we'll just quickly move on to Oliver's presentation, if that's okay with you, Oliver, and then we'll come back to Wheat in a minute and hope his sound will work better.
Hello, can you hear me?
So we can hear you.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for the time to present on this webinar. I'd like to first of all present a few aspects in terms of due diligence, and then the roles that monitoring organizations like NEPCON and others can play to actually help organizations comply with the EU timber regulation. So first of all, what is due diligence? If we go to the next slide. Next. I think Wheat will cover this in his presentation, but the basic things that operators or importers of timber products to the EU market have to keep in mind when conducting due diligence is that there are three main parts to the EU timber regulation. Firstly, there's a prohibition on placing known illegally harvested timber on the market. So if you have any evidence that your timber may have been illegally harvested, then that is prohibited to sell that in the EU. Secondly, even if you don't know that there is a risk of your timber being illegally harvested, you have to conduct due diligence. And due diligence is really research on where your timber products come from and what type of species are in your timber products in order to assess the risk that it may have been illegally harvested. And then once you've done that once, you have to maintain and regularly evaluate and update your risk assessments. So it's not just a one-time thing, it's an ongoing process so that you ensure that all of the timber that you're placing on the EU market is at low risk of having been illegally harvested. Next. Now, due diligence is a concept that we conduct in everyday life. It's exactly the same process as you might conduct when you're crossing a busy road. In this example, there's a gentleman crossing the road here. He would be taking in information from his surroundings in terms of the number of cars on the road, the speed that they're traveling at. He would then be conducting some form of risk assessment. So assessing the risk that he may be hurt in crossing this road, and then he would mitigate that risk or change what he's doing to avoid being hurt. And that may be moving faster to get across the road, that may be turning back to get to safety, or it may be stopping in the middle of the road to allow the traffic to go past him. And that's exactly the same principles that we use in timber risk assessment. So if we get next. That's a process of 3 steps: collecting information from your surroundings, assessing the risk, and then mitigating that risk. If we go next. We do exactly the same thing with timber supply chains, but we just use different information. So we're collecting information on the supply chain complexity, the species involved in the supply chain, the origin of the timber that we're sourcing, and what the risks may be at the origin of the country of harvest. So we conduct a risk assessment of all of that information that we've collected in order to evaluate, is that timber at risk of being illegally harvested? If it is, then we implement what we call risk mitigation options. Next. So when we're talking about legal harvest, what do we actually mean? Well, we're trying to assess the risk that the timber that we're sourcing may have not been harvested in accordance with applicable legislation, so the laws in place in the country of harvest. So whichever country that our timber has been sourced from may have slightly different laws in place that govern the harvest, the land's tenure, and we have to assess those, the compliance with those laws in every different country. So obviously this is quite a hard process to do when you may be sourcing from various different countries around the world, all with different laws in place. So how can you actually do this? Well, let's look first at due diligence in practice and give a few examples. So the first step that most companies conduct is to actually access that information. And that's usually first mapping your supply chain, so knowing the factories that you're sourcing from. Then does your factory source from a trader or a broker, or do they source from a sawmill? Does the sawmill source from a forest, or do they also source from another trader? First mapping out all of the companies involved in that supply chain as far back as you can reasonably do in the supply chain. Next is to collect supporting evidence on that supply chain. So can you provide not just your supplier's declaration on which companies are involved in the supply chain, but can you provide an invoice trail showing the trade between those companies? And then can you collect relevant documentation showing, indicating legal export from the country of harvest, even legal harvest at forest level if applicable. Once you've collected all that information, then you go to step 2, which is actually assessing the information. The purpose of collecting all of that information is not just to keep it in a drawer, it's actually you're collecting the information in order to conduct your risk assessment. So you compare the information across the documents that you have covered, that you've collected, in order to assess, is my timber legally harvested? Now, there are 5 main categories of issues that we want to be looking at when we're assessing whether our timber was legally harvested, and these are actually set out in the EU timber regulation to guide operators. These cover things like legal rights to harvest. Was the land legally owned by the forest manager? Taxes and fees. Was VAT paid on the sale of those timber products when they were sold? Was stumpage fees paid? Timber harvesting activities. Is it legally required to have an environmental impact assessment before you harvest your timber? Were legally required harvest permits applied for and in place before the timber was harvested? Fourth is third-party rights. That relates to usually local and indigenous peoples. Were there any laws in place in that country to give access and use rights to local people? And then 5th is trade and transport. Were all the transport permits that were legally required in that country of harvest applied for and in place for the transport of those products onwards from the forest? So there are 5 broad types of category of law that we're looking at in each country. But as we've said, the specific laws in different countries will vary quite widely. So as a small to medium-sized enterprise, how do you actually do this? Sometimes it can be a very tricky issue to tackle. So what NEPCON have done to aid companies and actually help direct this risk assessment is we've conducted what we call national risk assessments for over 60 timber-producing countries around the world. And these are a useful starting points to help you identify the laws in place in the country that you're sourcing from. Where are the main risks of non-compliance at a national level? Is there a national level of illegal harvesting? And if so, is that related to non-payment of taxes and fees, or is that related to abuse of indigenous rights, those kind of issues? And then which authorities implement each law? What documents can you actually collect from the supply chain to indicate compliance? And then if there is a risk at the national level, how can you actually mitigate that risk? What can you do as an operator? Next, I'll give you just 2 small examples of 2 of these types of risk assessment. The first is for Canada. This is what we consider a low-risk country, really. In the table on the right-hand side, you can see that we tackle these 5 categories of laws, legal rights to harvest, down through to trade and transport, but we actually break them up into smaller subcategories. I won't go into the detail here, but on the right-hand side of this table, you can see that the indicator here is green for most of these, showing low risk at the national level in Canada. This implies that there is clear laws in place, and at the national level, there is low risk that timber is illegally harvested for each of these types of law. The grey mark here shows that on one particular type of law, there aren't any laws in place. So whether or no legislation in place. Obviously, you don't have to comply with them. We look at Italy, where there is slightly more risk identified at the national level. So this risk, particular species and sites environmental harvesting and safe to harvest in Italy, but you may want to collect information on is the company that you're sourcing from in compliance with health and safety legislation. So actually focus your risk assessment much more. If you identify that any of these risks may be present in your supply chains, then your next step is to go to risk mitigation. So you may be able to collect additional information or documents to indicate compliance in your supply chain. So can the forest provide health and safety audit reports, for example? Can they provide the harvest permits? In some cases, the risk may be to do with the species or the origin of your timber, and you can actually conduct lab testing to verify that the species or the origin is the same as what your supplier is declaring. In some cases, for those real issues that can only be assessed at the forest level, for example, abuse of indigenous rights, you may want to conduct an audit of suppliers at the forest level, or you may want to visit your factories to ensure that they're not mixing your known and legal products with any unknown products in the factory. You may be able to work with suppliers to actually help them implement segregation measures or to reduce the sourcing from high-risk countries. You may be able to change supply chains slightly to avoid risk in your supply chains. A lot of companies choose to source FSC certified or PEFC certified products because you know that that's been audited at the forest level before it finds its way into your products. In some cases, the worst case scenario may be that you simply have to change a supplier or supply chain because they're not willing to cooperate to provide you the information. But that's always a last case scenario. So you can see from these kind of risk mitigation options that the decision on which mitigation option to take will often be driven by the nature of the risk, but it's always going to also be a financial or a business choice as well. What can you do as an organization? If we go to the next slide. So how can monitoring organizations actually help you implement the EU timber regulation and conduct your risk assessments? We mentioned at the start that NEPCON is a monitoring organization, and just to give you an overview of what a monitoring organization is, these are companies that have been assessed by the European Commission as competent to help organizations implement the EU timber regulation. Our role as monitoring organizations is to maintain and regularly evaluate a template due diligence system which can be used by operators. And NEPCON has a template due diligence system which can be found freely available on our website, but that's not to say that other organizations don't have due diligence systems that you can also use. The next step is that we are in charge of verifying the proper use of the due diligence system by operators. So if you come to us as an organization and ask us or any other monitoring organization to act in that capacity, then we would then be obliged to verify that you're conducting due diligence correctly. And then if you're not conducting, if you are implementing due diligence with significant or repeated failures, then we're legally obliged to inform the competent authority. So the role of monitoring organizations is actually to assist competent authorities to reach all of the different types of operators across the EU in recognition that it's quite a hard job for all of the competent authorities or the governments in various EU countries to reach all of those many timber producing and importing companies. So at the bottom of this slide there's a list of all of the monitoring organizations that can be found in the EU that you may wish to contact to help you implement your due diligence. Next, we can show the general services that monitoring organizations can usually offer to companies applying the EU timber regulation. We've mentioned that a due diligence system is essential for a monitoring organization. Each monitoring organization has to create a template system and keep that updated and make that available for any companies that wish to work with them as a monitoring organization. Next, many monitoring organizations also provide risk tools and advice to companies to actually help them comply with the EU timber regulation. Issues like training, data platforms to help you map your supply chains, supports to actually conduct those risk assessments. Lots of monitoring organizations can also provide timber testing through laboratories that they partner with, conduct supplier audits at the factory or the forest level, and then some organizations also provide certification of your due diligence system. So legal source certification is how NEPCON actually work with organizations as a monitoring organization. Anybody that wishes to work with us as an MO has to become legal source certified, and that is how we actually monitor the implementation of the EUTR. So that's a brief overview of due diligence, how to conduct it, and monitoring organizations. And now I'll hand over to Wheat, I think, for a presentation of the EUTR.
Thank you, Oliver. That was a great overview. We're going to try to go back to Wheat now. Excuse me as I just scroll back through the presentation and give you a brief insight into what is to come. Wheat, do we have you? Do we have you with us now?
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hello?
Thank you very much. Wheat, it's over to you now.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I am Wheat Rad. I understand my network connection passed out, so excuse me for that. Can we go to the slides, please? So I will give a little word on the introduce the timber regulation and its implementation in Belgium and the EU. As the NEPCON speaker already did explained a lot, I will go a little faster. So you have the timber regulation, which lays down obligations for operators who place timber on and timber products on the market. It's part of the action plan, EU action plan of 2003 on the forest law enforcement, governments and trades, better known as the Vlecht action plan, not to be confused with the Vlecht regulation. That's a regulation where the EU can conclude voluntary partnership agreements with partner countries in order to with commitments and action from both EU and the partner countries to halt the illegal timber. And important action is the license scheme to verify the legality of the timber exported to the EU. And this simplifies the procedure for entry into the EU market, because timber with such a license doesn't need to the obligations of the EU TR. But it's only active for Indonesia and very recently, since the 15th of November. Next slide. So the timber regulation entered into force 10 years after the EU action plan, Vlecht action plan, in March 2013. The scope is a broad range of timber products like solid wood, but also products like flooring, plywood, furniture, and even pulp and paper. And the scope is listed in the annex of the regulation. So the EU customs codes are listed there. Not all timber products are included. Recycled products are not included, but also other products like printed papers and are excluded of the scope. Important is to mention that the scope can be amended, and it's under discussion. So it is likely that it will change in the future, and that the EU Commission, the European Commission, will change the scope. One of the options is a full an all-in option. So all products that contain wood would fall under the UTR, but there are also challenges implied to that. So it is a discussion that will take place in the near future, and but it's still uncertain how it's gonna evolve. The timber regulation applies to imported and domestically produced timber, and as mentioned before, the timber under the Vlecht license is not included, and also the CITES convention, the convention on the international trade in endangered species is not does not require the obligations of the UTR. Next slide, please. The most important articles are Article 4, where it's that stated that illegal timber is prohibited, and that you have to elaborate, maintain, and evaluate due diligence system, like explained before, to prevent that illegal timber is placed on the market. And I'd like to mention also that there are also obligations for traders. So for timber that's already placed on the EU markets, there is a traceability obligation. So you have to prove the origin and the destination of the timber. So where it comes from, where it goes to, and you have to prove that by documents that you have to keep for 5 years. Next slide. And Article 6 is describes the due diligence system. I don't think I have to explain it any deeper. So it states that you have to gather information, evaluate and mitigate the risk, to a label. Next slide. A little word on due diligence, and a notion from a British legislative framework is that you have to do your best in the limit of your means, and there is comes the risk of subjective interpretation of the regulation, because so your means, to which point are you ready to mobilize them? So it's difficult. It creates a difficult situation for the operators as well as the competent authorities, and there is a need of coordination and common interpretation at the EU level. And I'd like to mention that it's an evolutive system. So what's good today, the best of tomorrow will be more strict than today's best. And then operators can choose, or they operate their own due diligence system, or they use the due diligence of a monitoring organization like NEPCON. Next slide. So I will not, this is already presented by our NEPCON speaker. Monitoring organizations, I'd just like to add that monitoring organizations are recognized by the European Commission, 13 at the moment, and they have to be checked by the national competent authorities, but there are no such organizations in Belgium, so we have no experience about that. Next slide. A quick word on the EU guidance document that was of early 2016, because I think it's a very useful document that wants to give guidance for the good implementation of the UTR. It has less legal value, although it will be the interpretation is onto the courts in the EU, but they will consider this this document, the guidance of this document. So I think it's an important document to explain the consensus interpretation between the member states and the European Commission. Next slide. As it explains a lot of unclear parts of the timber regulation. Here are 4 points, the four first points and the 4 most important points, I think. So like the definition of placing on the market, what's a negligible risk, what is what do you understand about complexity of the supply chain, and which documents are required for indicating the compliance with the applicable legislation. Next slide. And it contains also examples of documentation that can be used to to prove the legality. But these are only examples, and it's certainly not necessary in every case to have all those documents. Next slide. So how does it work in Belgium? I'm from the Belgian Federal Administration for the environment at the Product Policy Unit. We are the competent authority and responsible for the market surveillance strategy and its implementation. And we are the interface with the European Commission and responsible for the Belgian positions at the EU and international level. And we collaborate with our inspectorate, our inspectors to do the checks, and in collaboration with the customs where necessary. And I also like to mention our Royal Museum for Central Africa, which is a scientific expertise center for the timber identification. And this timber identification will play a more important role in the future, I think. And also the origin of timber can be checked by this instances. And there is also a European network that's developing for the timber identification. Next slide. So the checks, how does it work? It's mainly document review and also a little product inspection on site in Belgium. So we take some samples. We have a check plan that's based on a risk analysis, and also we check in a follow-up of complaints, NGOs. As I mentioned before, there is a huge risk of different therefore there
Stephanie, an introduction to bee pilot. Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Heather. Okay, So just a big thank you to our presenters up to now to really highlight the background of EUTR and the requirements of due diligence. And as mentioned, as a next step, what we really want to focus on is to show you a little bit about how FTA services can support you in the due diligence, and specifically through the BPI platform. So for those of you that aren't familiar with BPI, on the slide now is just a quick overview of what the BPI system looks like. So it's a platform where our members sign in and map their supply chain or have access to the farm. And the first step is for the producers to fill out a self-assessment of improvement and resources that can help you to follow up and measure progress. If we go to the next slide, just an overview of how BPI can really support members with EUTR. So first of all, a better understanding of the timber regulation. That's why we're doing the webinar today. We also have the risk session at the upcoming FTA conference on the same topic, and we will continue to be providing guidance documents and training for members and on the requirements of EUTR. The other aspect of how we can support you is an increased visibility. So as I mentioned, producers in BPI fill out the self-assessment questionnaire, and we are in the progress of enhancing those questions to cover procurement of raw materials and origin of raw materials, and specifically to cover sustainability certifications that already exist in the supply chain, to give our members a good overview and a good first step into this risk analysis that both Oliver and Meet covered in their presentations. The next step, the next aspect is around access to information. So what we want to do is to provide a dedicated space on the BPI platform where the producers, so the factories, can actually upload and share with their different customers documentation related to the sustainability of their raw materials. So this gives you, first of all, an overview of where the products are coming from, how they were sourced, and then also some extra documentation if needed. Okay, next slide. So this just, I'm just going to go quickly through it. This gives you an overview of sort of the process. So as I mentioned, the first step is the self-assessment. Producer selection. So based on the answers in the self-assessment, you could select certain production facilities to what we're going to call the raw material documentation module in order to collect more detailed information for specific raw materials. So based on your own risk assessment. So that's the data collection piece. Data sharing, because producers will be able to share the information with all linked participants or only certain participants if they choose to do so. And then the BPI members will of course have access to that documentation. Just trying to go to the next. Oh yeah. So the next step would then be follow-up and verification. So BPI members will easily be able to keep track of which documents have been submitted and the information as mentioned on the origin and species of timber. So to make it easy to know which maybe areas of your supply chain will need additional follow-up and verification. So this is in line with what Oliver presented in terms of the requirements of due diligence. Of course, a big aspect of the FTA services is also training, so both for our members, but also for the factories and producing countries on which sort of requirements and how to comply with EUTR, and reporting as well. So through the platform and the sustainability dashboards, all the information on your supply chain is effectively in one place, organized and easy to manage. So that's just a brief introduction on the timber pilot, which will be kicking off soon and will be open to all BPI members. If you or your company would like to participate and involve your factories, you can get in touch with me. My email address is here. We will share the slides afterwards, so you can always follow up for more information or questions if you have. But we would really like to get a good number of members involved to make sure that we are developing the system in a way that best meets your needs and will be of real assistance to you going forward with your due diligence requirements. Just a quick point on our upcoming FTA conference. So if you haven't already done so, we would ask you to register for the event. It's a free event. It's also the FTA's 40th anniversary, so it's going to be quite a big celebration. And we will have a session on June 15th on EU timber regulation. We'll have Oliver there, who was a speaker today. We'll also have a key account manager from FSC and a senior policy analyst from Forest Trends. So a very good lineup of speakers to go more in depth in the topic of EU TR in sort of a panel debate session. Also a lot of other very interesting sessions at the conference, so check out the website, and we hope to see many of you there.
Thank you, Stephanie. So now we can move to the question and answer session. Please also, because I will take the liberty as I am organising the conference, please do register. Spaces are filling up very fast. It will be the biggest FTA conference yet. So take this opportunity to come and join us. As a first question, let me ask Oliver. Oliver, who is responsible for due diligence? Who is known as the operator?
Hi. Okay, the operator is usually the company that is clearing customs at the point of entry to the European Union. So in most cases that's the importer, the importing company to the EU. But in some cases it may be your trader or broker if you're using a logistics company to import that product to the EU market. But the way to really decide is to have that conversation with your supplier to make sure to see if they think that they are. But you can also check on what's known as the single administrative document. That is the customs clearance document that you fill in when you're applying for customs clearance, and it's the company on that single administrative document, or SAD, that's named as the consignee. That is usually how most competent authorities will decide whether you're the operator or not. But I'll probably ask for Wheat to confirm how they decide that in Belgian cases. But that's usually how we identify who the operator is.
Yes, I confirm that, and I would like to mention the guidance document where it's explained also. Thank you.
Okay. The next question comes from Mr. Garrett. Wheat, I think this is directed at you. The scope of products that fall under 995 2010 do not include printed paper. He asks, what about bags made of printed paper?
I do not exactly know the details of this, but I think all printed media is excluded. I would have to look it up, but if it's not in the listed the list of the annex of the regulation, it's not included.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a question. Sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to add to that. In the annex to the EU timber regulation, the way that products are included or not included to the regulation is based on what's known as the Harmonized System Code, or the HS code, under which different products are imported. So it may be that you know the name of the type of product that you're importing, but really you need to look at the customs code that you're importing that product under, and that will give you the unambiguous kind of reference as to whether that's included or excluded. If it's included, that HS code will be listed in the back of the EU timber regulation.
Thank you very much. Another question, sort of related, is there any list country-wise of the legal document that could be used as a reference? Oliver, is this something that you could answer?
Yeah, I can do. Well, there's no definitive list, unfortunately, and this is always the most challenging part for operators. The national risk assessments that I presented that have been created by NEPCON, in the ones that I presented in my presentation, do give lists of all of the documentation required for particular laws, and really it depends on what the risks are within your country as to which type of documents that you would want to be collecting, because the EU TR is always a risk-based approach. So there's not one set of documents for every country around the world, but you would want to identify, is there a national level risk to do with harvesting permits? If so, you'd want to collect the harvest permits, then you could look into those national risk assessments to try to identify the particular type of documents that you can collect. There's also lots of information online for various countries. WWF have done some country guides highlighting particular documents to collect. I know that the Forest Legality Alliance website, I think that's now been discontinued, but it still does have information up on the website for different countries identifying the types of documents to collect. So it's usually good to Google the country and the documents to collect, and you can find that from various sources. But obviously I can certainly say that those NEPCON risk assessments are a good starting point.
Thank you, Oliver. I have a question for Stephanie from the FTA. We have the question that the challenge is really to verify that documents are correct and that they're not fake. Is there any kind of support connected to the BEPI platform?
So that's a good question, actually. So as I mentioned, the platform will be a space where you can have information on your supply chain, do a first risk assessment, understand which documents you have, what you might need to follow up on. And in terms of assistance in knowing if the documents are legitimate or sort of going further in your due diligence, this is where we'd like to open the idea of having organizations like NEPCON, so monitoring organizations, access the information as a service provider. So as you know, probably in BEPI and BSCI, we work with accredited service providers, assessors, auditors, consultants, and so part of the work of the pilot will be to see how we can incorporate that process to say if you have collected your documentation, you deem it necessary, where you've done your risk assessment and you think you need to take a further step in verification, how we could provide access to those accredited monitoring organizations, which, as Oliver mentioned, have been verified by the European Commission to do that work. Hopefully that answers your question.
I have one more question for Stephanie. Mm-hmm. The BEPI training sessions, are they also open to BSCI participants who are not yet BEPI members?
Okay, so the pilot program that we'll be running will be for BEPI members, and as such we would ask that you become a member of BEPI, to invite your BEPI to access the self-assessment and to therefore have access as well to BEPI training sessions. For BSCI members, just to quickly mention, joining BEPI is free of cost. It's just a bit of a formality to sign our terms of implementation and you have access to our platform. So from that point of view, it's very easy. Any of the producers that you have added in the BSCI system will also be available to you in the BEPI platform. So it's quite an easy process, but indeed it's the pilot program is run for BEPI members.
So we are now at 11 o'clock. I will just take one more question from Britta Stahl. She has asked, the EU timber regulation does not cover printed paper, but do they have the obligation to secure pulp going through the packaging or printed paper material in their consumer boxes? I think I'll put this question forward to Oliver. Oliver, could you support in answering this question? If not, we can come back and answer all the unanswered questions.
Yeah, I can do my best. I'd start again with looking at what HS code you're importing these under. If it's printed material and the HS code for printed material is used, then that if you're importing it under a HS code for boxes, wooden or paper boxes, then that may be included, and you need to actually look that up in the. I can also provide Stephanie and Heather a page on our website which lists those HS. But yes, if it's included, then you would need to know the pulp and paper sources included within those as far back in the supply chain as possible. But it may not be included in the EUTR at all, and therefore you'd be exempt from the need to conduct risk assessment.
Thank you, Oliver. I will just put the question forward to Stephanie for a last comment.
Okay, so I just wanted to quickly mention also that I think
Tweets made a very good point when he mentioned the current scope of the EUTR is one aspect, but I think it's really important and also an important message for many of our members that the scope is in discussion and that it could be expanded, an all-in option. There, of course, will be other degrees of options available, but I think it's an important thing to note that we would advise members of FTA to be ready for the coming changes in the legislation and the possibility that more and more products will come into scope. So to preempt that a little bit and to be prepared, use the resources that are available to you through FTA services to be ready for when it potentially changes in the future. So I think that was a good point that we made, and just wanted to reiterate that as a final point before we close. I'll hand back over to Heather just for some logistical points before we say goodbye.
Thank you very much, everyone. We did have several questions on how you can find resources and will the webinar be recorded. We will share all the resources. The webinar is recorded and the slides will be available. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to the panelists for joining and sharing their knowledge. And thank you for all the presenters who have joined us today. We will be in touch with all the follow-up material, and we wish you a very nice day. Goodbye.